Welcome to a world of wonder where ancient legends are whispered through the trees and tales of hope and sacrifice carry us on soft winds. Tonight, as you settle into a peaceful rest, let your mind drift to the kingdom of Elendor, a land where the skies once shimmered and the forest held secrets long forgotten. Breathe deeply and allow the gentle rhythm of this tale to guide you into a calm, restful sleep. Close your eyes and let go of the day, for we are about to begin a journey through a legend, the legend of the phoenix feather. In the shadows of forgotten scrolls, where dust thickened the air and ancient ink cracked upon brittle parchment, the prophecy lay hidden. Few dared speak of it. Fewer still believed. Yet it lingered in the world like a half-remembered dream, woven into the fabric of things long buried. It was said that a feather from the phoenix, the fabled bird of flame and rebirth, held within its soft tendrils the power to call the dead back from the shadowed lands. But not all were worthy. Only those driven by a noble cause, untouched by greed or selfishness, could awaken such power. It was this prophecy that drifted through the cracked stones of Elendor's walls, whispered in hushed tones among the servants, courtiers, and travellers who passed through the kingdom. A prophecy told only in shadows, as though the very telling of it carried a danger too great for the light of day. It spoke of a time of despair, of a land on the brink of ruin, and of a heart so burdened with grief that it would seek out the phoenix's feather in a final, desperate act. But prophecies, like the wind, are elusive things, coming and going as they please, often unnoticed until it is too late. And so, the legend of the phoenix feather had slipped from the minds of all but the oldest and most secretive of sages. Yet, in the darkened corners of the king's chambers, where the flames of the hearth flickered low, the prophecy stirred once more. King Arthur sat in silence, his hands pressed tightly against the cold marble of his daughter's tomb. The stone beneath his palms was unyielding, much like the sorrow that clung to him, an unshakable weight that threatened to drag him into an abyss. Princess Alara, his only child, lay still in the silence of death, her once vibrant beauty now preserved in a tragic stillness. The illness that had claimed her was swift, mysterious and cruel, leaving behind a kingdom in mourning and a king broken by grief. In the suffocating quiet of his despair, a sound, a soft, almost imperceptible rustle, cut through the air like a whisper. Arthur's eyes flickered toward the source, seeing nothing but the dancing shadows of the hearth. But the sound lingered, as if carried on a breeze no window had allowed. A moment passed, and then another, before the king's mind, clouded with sorrow, caught the faintest echo of a memory, the prophecy. It was an old tale, one he had dismissed as mere folklore in his youth. But now, with his daughter lost and the kingdom slipping through his fingers, desperation made him grasp at anything that held the faintest glimmer of hope. A feather, they had said. A single feather plucked from the phoenix could bring life where death had claimed dominion, but only if the heart that sought it was pure. He had no choice. The kingdom of Elendor was dying along with its princess. The crops had withered, and sickness crept into the villages, leaving the people in a state of hopelessness. Elara had been their light, the one who could have restored their hope, but now, even that had been taken. The king called for his most trusted advisor, an old sage who had once served his father. The man arrived with the weight of years in his eyes, his long robes trailing like whispers against the cold stone floors. "There is an ancient tale," the king began, his voice barely a murmur, "of a feather that can bring back the dead." The sage's gaze sharpened, though his expression remained unreadable. "The phoenix feather," he said, his voice low and laced with caution. "A thing of legend, my lord. Its power is great, but it does not come without risk." "I care nothing for risks," Arthon replied, his desperation bleeding through the cracks in his regal composure. "If there is even the slightest chance that it can bring Elara back, then I must find it." The sage's silence stretched, deep and ominous. "The phoenix," he said at last, "can only be found by those who are truly worthy. It is not a quest for the faint of heart, nor the impure. Should you seek it with anything but noble purpose, the feather will turn to ash." King Arthon's hands trembled, though whether from fear or resolve, even he did not know. "Then I shall send the one man who I know is pure of heart, Sir Lysander." Thus the prophecy stirred once more, as the king's command set into motion a journey that would shape the fate of Elendor, and perhaps even the world beyond. The tale of the phoenix feather was no longer a whisper. It had become a pulse, a rhythm beating through the heart of the dying kingdom, where hope and despair now walked hand in hand. The kingdom of Elendor was a place once rich with life, its meadows golden with wheat, its forests thick with trees that whispered ancient secrets. But now, the land had turned brittle and silent. The rivers that once sang through the valleys ran sluggish, their once clear waters clouded with decay. Crops lay withered in the fields, and the air had taken on a bitter edge, as though the very earth recoiled from some unseen sickness. At the heart of it all, in the towering citadel that crowned the capital city, King Arthon stood on the brink of madness. His once proud kingdom was now a shadow of itself, and his people, once vibrant and hopeful, were gaunt with fear. It was not just the crops that had failed. A strange illness had begun to creep through the villages, its origin as mysterious as it was deadly. And as though the land mirrored the king's grief, the kingdom had begun to die with his daughter. Princess Elara had been the light of Elendor, the hope of its future. Her beauty was matched only by her compassion, and the people had adored her with a fervour that bordered on worship. It was she who had soothed their fears in times of drought, and it was she who had given them hope when war had knocked at their borders. Her laughter had been a balm for the wounded heart of Elendor, and with her death, it seemed that all warmth had fled the kingdom. Elara had fallen ill in the heart of spring, just as the first blossoms of the year began to unfurl. What should have been a season of renewal had instead become a season of despair. The sickness had come swiftly, like a thief in the night, and no healer or sage could name it. It took her strength first, then her breath, leaving her pale and still as the moonlight. Arthon had watched helplessly as the light faded from his daughter's eyes, and with it, his hope. Now, she lay entombed in a chamber of cold stone, beneath the watchful gaze of statues carved in her likeness. The people whispered of her even in death, speaking of how the kingdom seemed to mourn with her passing. Rumours spread like wildfire, rumours that the land itself was cursed, that Elendor's fall had been foretold in forgotten prophecies. But none dared speak those rumours aloud in the presence of the king. King Arthon had always been a man of action, a warrior who had built his kingdom with his own hands, a ruler who commanded respect and loyalty from his people. But now, grief had rendered him silent. He moved through the days like a spectre, his eyes hollow, his mind trapped in the memory of his daughter's final breath. Desperation had taken root in his heart, growing like a dark vine that choked out reason and hope. It was this desperation that had led him to the old sage's tale of the phoenix feather. For days, the king had wrestled with the weight of the prophecy, its words turning over and over in his mind like the grinding of millstones. Could it be true? Could such a thing as the phoenix feather really exist? And if so, would it bring Elara back to him? He had little choice but to believe. His kingdom was dying, his people were suffering, and he was powerless to stop it. In the echoing halls of the citadel, Arthon summoned his most trusted knight, Sir Lysander. Lysander had been by his side through battles and sieges, a man of unshakable loyalty and courage. The knight had a reputation for both strength and honour, his name spoken with reverence among the people of Elendor. If anyone could succeed in such an impossible task, it was Lysander. The king stood in the shadow of his daughter's tomb when Lysander arrived. The silence between them was heavy, weighed down by unspoken grief. Arthon did not turn to face the knight immediately. Instead, he kept his gaze fixed on the stone effigy of Elara, as though willing her to awaken. "I have need of you, Lysander," the king finally spoke, his voice rough with the strain of too many sleepless nights. "A need unlike any I have ever asked before." Lysander stepped forward, his armour gleaming faintly in the dim light of the tomb. "My liege," he said, bowing his head, "you know I will serve you in whatever way I can." There is a tale, Arthon continued, his voice barely more than a whisper, of a feather, once said to be taken from the phoenix itself. They say it has the power to bring the dead back to life. Lysander's brow furrowed. A myth, sire, surely. No, Arthon interrupted, his voice sharp now, filled with the edge of desperation. I would not waste my time on myth. I have reason to believe it exists. I must. My daughter... His words trailed off, swallowed by the silence. For a moment neither man spoke. The air between them seemed thick with the weight of what was being asked. Lysander met the king's gaze, his heart heavy. He had faced many challenges in service to Elendor, but never before had he been asked to hunt a legend. I will find it, sire, Lysander finally said, his voice steady. If it exists, I will bring it back. And so, the dying kingdom placed its final hope on the shoulders of a single man as the shadow of the phoenix feather loomed over them all. The road stretched endlessly before Sir Lysander, winding through lands as forsaken as the kingdom he left behind. The sky, once bright with the warmth of summer, now hung heavy with thick, brooding clouds that seemed to press down on the world, muting even the light of the sun. Each step his horse took felt weighted, as if the earth itself resisted his journey. Every village he passed bore the same signs, fields lying fallow, the people thin and hollow-eyed, their once vibrant lives reduced to mere survival. Yet it was not the emptiness of the land that gnawed at Lysander, but the silence. The world seemed unnaturally still, as though it held its breath, waiting for something, perhaps for him to fail, as so many others had before. For the feather was not the first thing he had hunted, nor the first legend he had followed. But this journey felt different. It was not just the weight of the king's command that sat heavy on his shoulders, but the murmurs of the prophecy that had found their way into his heart, unbidden and unwelcomed. He knew what they whispered, those who dared speak the legend aloud, that the phoenix was no mere bird, but a being of ancient magic, born in the flames of the world's first dawn. Its feathers were said to shimmer with the colours of a fire long forgotten, a fire that could only be tamed by those with hearts untainted by darkness. It was said that to seek the phoenix was to face one's truest self, and few could bear the reflection they found. Lysander pressed onward, the cryptic map given to him by the sage folded within his breastplate, close to his heart. The lines on it were strange, shifting as though alive, guiding him not through the physical world, but through a realm of shadows and half-truths. He could not shake the sense that the map itself was testing him, showing him what he needed to see only when it deemed him worthy. Days turned into nights, and the land shifted beneath him. The further he travelled from Elendor, the stranger the world became. The trees grew taller, their twisted branches casting long, gnarled shadows that seemed to watch him. The air grew colder despite the season, and the light of the sun became a pale imitation of itself, as though it too was afraid to touch this cursed place. It was in this half-light that Lysander first noticed the changes within himself. The journey, which had once felt like a quest for hope, now seemed to pull at something darker within him. Memories of the past flickered unbidden before his eyes. Images of battles fought, blood spilled, and the lives he had taken in service to the crown. They were memories he had long buried, yet now they resurfaced like ghosts, haunting his every step. One night, as he camped by a fire that seemed reluctant to burn, the shadows grew restless. He could feel them moving just beyond the edge of the flames, circling like wolves waiting for their moment to strike. But it was not wolves that he feared. It was the darkness within his own heart. Could he truly claim that his quest was noble? Was he here only for the king, for the kingdom? Or was there a part of him that sought glory in the impossible? These thoughts plagued him as the days wore on, gnawing at his resolve. He began to doubt the prophecy, the feather, and even himself. Yet each time he considered turning back, something in the wind, a whisper, a breath, would push him forward. He could almost feel the phoenix watching him, its eyes unseen but ever present, judging his every choice. At last, after what felt like an eternity of wandering, Lysander reached the edge of the map's markings. Before him lay a great chasm, its depths obscured by a thick, swirling mist that seemed alive. The land on the other side was a dark expanse, its trees twisted and black, their leaves sharp as blades. This was the entrance to the cursed forest, a place spoken of only in the most fearful of legends. It was said that no man who entered the forest ever returned, for the spirits of the dead wandered its paths, whispering secrets that could drive a man to madness. But Lysander had no choice. Beyond that forest lay the phoenix, and with it, the feather that could bring the dead back to life. He took a deep breath, steeling himself against the fear that gnawed at his bones. His hands tightened on the reins of his horse, and without another word, he urged it forward. The air grew colder still as they crossed into the forest, the mist closing in around them like a living thing. The trees towered above, their branches twisted and gnarled, blocking out what little light remained. Every sound, every rustle of leaves, every creak of wood seemed amplified, as though the forest itself was alive and watching. But it was not the trees that Lysander feared. It was what lay within them, the voices that began to whisper as soon as he set foot on the cursed ground. They whispered of failure, of death, of a feather that could turn to ash in unworthy hands. And so, the hunt for the phoenix feather began in earnest, with darkness pressing in from all sides and the weight of fate heavy upon Lysander's heart. The cursed forest was more than a place. It was a presence, thick and oppressive, filling the air with an ancient malevolence that slithered through the trees like a serpent. The moment Sir Lysander crossed the threshold, he felt it, deep in his bones, a chill far colder than any winter wind. The mist clung to him, swirling around his legs, wrapping itself in thin tendrils around his armour, as if it sought to drag him down into the earth itself. His horse whinnied in protest, its breath forming clouds in the unnatural chill, but Lysander urged it forward with a quiet murmur. He too felt the weight of something watching from the shadows, something waiting. The trees loomed higher here, their gnarled branches twisted and contorted, like skeletal arms reaching out to snatch away any foolish enough to venture into their domain. Their bark was blackened, as if charred by some ancient fire, and their leaves hung low and sharp, whispering secrets in the wind. Yet it was not the trees that unsettled Lysander most, nor the mist that thickened with every step deeper into the forest. It was the silence, the absence of life, of sound. No birds called, no insects buzzed. Even the wind seemed afraid to stir too loudly. It was a silence so deep that it swallowed everything whole, even the sound of his own footsteps. And beneath that silence, something pulsed. A slow, rhythmic thrum, like the heartbeat of the forest itself. He had been warned about this place, told stories by men who no longer spoke of it for fear that even its memory might reach out and take them. The forest was a graveyard, they said, but not of bones, of souls. Those who entered seeking the phoenix seldom returned, and those who did spoke of shadows that whispered in their ears, of voices that rose up from the mist to mock and beguile. But no one had ever seen the spirits themselves. Only their presence lingered in the cold air, waiting for the next soul to add to their number. Lysander had no choice. His path led through the heart of this cursed place, and the phoenix feather, if it existed at all, lay on the other side. Every step felt heavier, every breath harder to draw. The mist grew thicker, more oppressive, until it felt as though the very air resisted him. And still, the whispers began. At first they were faint, no more than a breath on the wind. They called his name, softly, almost lovingly, as if spoken by someone he had once known. Then, as the mist deepened, the voices became clearer, more insistent. They whispered of failure, of doom, of the futility of his quest. They spoke of King Arthur's despair, of the land's decay, and of the princess who would never awaken. He tried to shut them out, focusing instead on the path before him. But the whispers grew louder, slipping through the cracks in his mind like water through a sieve. "Turn back," they urged, their voices soft as silk. "There is nothing for you here but death. She is lost. The kingdom is lost. There is no feather, no magic to bring her back. Only sorrow, only darkness." Lysander gritted his teeth, forcing himself onward, though doubt gnawed at him like a hungry beast. He had faced death many times in battle, had stood before armies with nothing but his sword and his will. But this was different. This was a war of the mind, and the forest knew his weaknesses. Suddenly, his horse reared, its hooves flailing in the air as if struck by some unseen force. Lysander barely had time to steady it before a shadow swept through the mist, dark and formless, moving too quickly to be seen clearly. His heart thundered in his chest as he reached for his sword, his eyes scanning the shifting fog. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a suffocating silence that pressed against his ears, thick as the mist. Then, through the veil of white, a shape emerged. A figure, tall and thin, its face obscured by a hood, stood before him, silent and unmoving. It did not speak, but Lysander felt its eyes upon him, cold and calculating. He raised his sword, though a part of him knew that steel would do little here. The figure did not move, but the air around it seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. "Who are you?" Lysander demanded, his voice echoing strangely in the stillness. The figure remained silent for a moment longer, and then, in a voice that was both distant and near, it spoke. "The forest watches," it said, its words soft but heavy with meaning. "It knows what you seek, and it knows your heart. You cannot hide from it." Lysander tightened his grip on his sword, his knuckles white. "I seek the phoenix feather," he replied, his voice steady, though the figure's presence sent a chill down his spine. "I seek it to save a life." The figure tilted its head slightly, as if considering his words. "A life," it repeated, and then slowly it lifted a hand from within the folds of its cloak, pointing to the path ahead. "The forest tests all who enter. Only the worthy find what they seek." And with that, the figure melted back into the mist, leaving Lysander alone once more. The silence returned, heavier now, laden with a sense of impending judgment. The path ahead seemed darker, more foreboding, as though the forest itself had awakened, ready to test the knight's heart. Lysander took a deep breath and urged his horse forward. He knew now that the cursed forest was not merely a place of shadows. It was a trial, and the true danger lay not in the spirits that haunted it, but in the darkness that lay within himself. The deeper Lysander ventured into the cursed forest, the more it seemed to warp around him, as if the very fabric of the world had grown distorted. Time itself became uncertain. Whether he had been walking for hours or days, he could not say. The mist, ever thick and clinging, seemed alive now, whispering his name, breathing soft threats into his ear. But beyond the mist, something else stirred, an ancient presence, heavy and watchful, lurking in the dark spaces between the trees. It was then that he saw it. A great oak, larger than any tree Lysander had ever seen, stood in the heart of the forest, its twisted roots snaking out like the tendrils of some ancient beast. Its bark was blackened with age, cracked and scarred as though it had witnessed centuries pass in silence. The air around it was thick with an energy that felt both sacred and sinister. This tree was not merely part of the forest. It was the forest, its very heart, the nexus of all that was cursed and forgotten in these woods. Before the tree, half hidden in the shadows, stood a figure. Unlike the fleeting shape that had confronted Lysander earlier, this one was solid, unmoving, a silent sentinel guarding the secrets of the forest. Its form was draped in a cloak the colour of deep twilight, blending into the gloom around it, and where its face should have been, there was only darkness. Lysander approached cautiously, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, though he knew deep in his bones that no blade could protect him from what lay ahead. The figure made no move, no sound. It simply waited, as if it had been waiting for him all along. He could feel its gaze, though it had no eyes, fixed upon him, probing the deepest corners of his heart. "Who are you?" Lysander's voice cut through the thick silence, though it sounded distant, as though the forest itself swallowed the sound before it could travel far. The figure shifted slightly, its cloak whispering against the ground. "I am the Watcher," it said, its voice a low murmur, neither male nor female, but something that echoed from the roots of the world itself. "I have seen the rise and fall of kingdoms. I have witnessed the birth of stars and the death of men, and I stand guard over the trials of this forest." Lysander frowned, though a part of him had expected this. "The phoenix feather," he said, his voice steady, despite the chill that had settled into his bones. "I seek it to save my kingdom, to bring life where there is only death." The Watcher tilted its head, considering his words with a weight that pressed down on Lysander's soul. "Many have sought the phoenix feather," it said, "but few have passed the test. For the feather is not given freely, it must be earned, and the price for it is not measured in gold or blood, but in the purity of one's heart." Lysander's grip tightened on his sword. "I have come this far," he said, his voice firm. "I will pass whatever test the forest demands." The Watcher was silent for a moment, and when it spoke again, there was something almost sorrowful in its tone. "The test is not of strength nor of will. It is of sacrifice." With a slow, deliberate motion, the Watcher lifted a hand from within its cloak. In its palm lay something small and faintly glowing, a shard of light, like the remnants of a star, flickering with an otherworldly brilliance. "This," it said, "is a piece of your soul. The forest demands it as payment for passage. You will give it freely, or you will go no further." Lysander stared at the glowing fragment in the Watcher's hand, feeling the weight of the moment settle over him. A part of his soul, was this the price for the phoenix feather? He had known there would be trials, but this... This was more than he had bargained for. "What will happen if I give it?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. The watcher's hooded face remained impassive. "You will lose a part of yourself. Forever. It will be taken from you, locked away in the roots of this forest, never to return. But in exchange, the path to the phoenix will be opened." Lysander's mind raced. Could he make such a sacrifice? Could he truly give away a piece of his soul, knowing it would be lost forever? And what would that mean for the man he would become afterward? But then, as the doubt clawed at him, the image of Princess Elara came to him. Her pale face, her still body lying entombed in stone. His kingdom was falling apart. The people were suffering. He had been entrusted with this task, and there was no room for hesitation. "I will give it," he said, his voice resolute. The watcher nodded, and with the flick of its wrist, the shard of light was gone, absorbed into the shadows of the great tree. Lysander felt a coldness settle over him, deep and hollow, as though something vital had been torn from his chest. But he stood firm, his heart unwavering. "Very well," the watcher said, stepping aside. "The path is open. But beware, knight. What you have lost here will haunt you. It is the price of seeking what cannot be easily found." With those final words, the watcher faded into the mist, leaving Lysander alone before the towering oak. Beyond it, the forest grew darker still, but the way ahead had been revealed. A narrow path winding through the shadows, leading deeper into the heart of the cursed land. And so, Lysander continued forward, knowing that the greatest trials were yet to come. The path beyond the great oak was no longer a mere trail through the forest. It felt like a descent into something older, darker, and far more treacherous. The air grew heavier with each step, thick with the scent of burning, though no flames could yet be seen. Lysander's breath came in shallow gasps, his chest tight from the cold emptiness left by the sacrifice he had made. The shard of his soul now lay buried in the roots of the cursed forest, and with it had gone something vital, something that could not be named but was deeply felt. Yet he pressed on, his heart a tangle of grief and resolve. He had passed the watcher's test, but he knew that was only the beginning. Ahead, the path grew steeper, winding upward into a landscape that seemed to defy the laws of the world he had once known. The trees grew twisted and jagged, their branches blackened as if they had been scorched by an ancient fire. The ground beneath his feet was no longer soft with moss or leaves, but hardened and cracked, as though the earth itself had been seared by a force long forgotten. It was then that he saw it, the glow on the horizon, a faint shimmer of red and gold, pulsing like a heartbeat. The phoenix. Somewhere beyond that light, the creature of legend awaited him, but between them stood a wall of flame, the trial of fire. Lysander approached cautiously, his hand instinctively resting on the hilt of his sword, though he knew that no steel would help him here. The flames stretched high, their tongues licking the sky, alive with a heat that seemed to hum with life. They danced and flickered in strange, hypnotic patterns, shifting from red to gold to white-hot brilliance. The path led straight through the inferno, and there was no way around it. For a moment he hesitated. The heat was already unbearable, and he had not even touched the fire. The flames seemed to whisper to him, just as the forest had, except these whispers were sharper, more urgent, hissing secrets in a language he could not understand. The words coiled around his thoughts like smoke, filling his mind with doubt. "You cannot pass," the fire seemed to say. "You are unworthy. The feather is not for you." Lysander clenched his fists, shaking his head to clear the voices. He had come too far to be undone now. He thought of Elara, her pale face framed by the stone of her tomb, her life stolen too soon by a sickness no healer could cure. He thought of King Arthur, consumed by grief, and the people of Elendor, their hope withering like the crops in the fields. They were all depending on him. But the fire did not care about his reasons, nor about the noble cause that drove him. It would burn through lies and truths alike. The flames cared only for the purity of the heart that sought to pass through them. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes. The shard of his soul he had lost to the Watcher felt like a gaping wound within him, a hollow place where once there had been warmth. He was not whole, and the forest knew it. The fire knew it. But still, he had made his choice. He had sacrificed, and he would sacrifice more if need be. That was the price of the phoenix feather. Lysander opened his eyes and stepped forward. The heat surged as he approached, the flames roaring louder as though they sensed his presence. But he did not stop. He walked straight into the fire, and in that moment, the world dissolved into light and pain. The fire was everywhere. It tore at his armor, seared his skin, and filled his lungs with burning air. It was as if the very essence of flame had entered his body, seeking to consume him from within. His vision blurred, the world reduced to a blaze of red and gold. The whispers grew louder, screaming now, voices of despair and anger, telling him to turn back, to surrender, to give in to the flames. But Lysander did not yield. He focused on the one thing that still anchored him, the memory of Elara. He had failed to protect her in life. He would not fail her in death. With every step, the fire tried to take more from him, burning deeper, scorching not only his flesh but his spirit. But he kept moving, one agonizing step after another, until something changed. The fire began to fade. The heat lessened, the flames no longer biting at him with the same ferocity. He could feel the light dimming, the path before him clearing. And then, with one final step, Lysander emerged from the inferno, breathless and trembling, his body covered in soot and ash, his armor blackened. The air was cool again, the fire behind him silent. Ahead, the glow he had seen earlier grew brighter, and Lysander knew he was close. He had passed through the trial of fire, but at what cost? His body ached, and the hollow space within him felt deeper, as though the fire had taken more than just flesh. But there was no time for reflection. The phoenix awaited, and with it the final test. The forest, now quiet and still, seemed to hold its breath, as if the very world had paused to see if he would succeed where so many others had failed. And so, with the weight of sacrifice upon him, Lysander pressed forward into the light, knowing that the final judgment would soon be at hand. Beyond the inferno, the air was still and sharp, carrying with it the scent of something ancient, something sacred. Lysander's body throbbed from the fire's relentless assault. His skin raw and blistered beneath the soot-streaked armor. But the flames had not taken his resolve. He had survived the trial of fire, though the cost had been steep, and the hollow within him grew deeper with each step. Ahead, the forest gave way to a clearing bathed in a light that was neither day nor night, but something between. A soft golden glow that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The trees surrounding the clearing were unlike those in the cursed woods he had passed through. They were tall and graceful, their leaves shimmering as if kissed by stardust. And there, at the heart of the light, stood the phoenix. It was more magnificent than the legends had spoken. Its feathers blazed in hues of gold, red, and deep orange, shifting with every breath it took, like the molten heart of the sun itself. Its wings, vast and shimmering, stretched to either side, and as they moved, they sent sparks cascading into the air. The phoenix did not perch or rest. It hovered in the air, suspended by some unseen force. Its glowing eyes fixed on Lysander, with a gaze that felt as if it pierced straight into his soul. Lysander hesitated at the edge of the clearing, his breath catching in his chest. For a long moment, neither he nor the phoenix moved. He felt small before its ancient presence, insignificant in the face of a creature that had lived through the rise and fall of countless kingdoms. Here was the source of all legends, the embodiment of rebirth, of life after death. And yet, there was no warmth in its gaze, only an unwavering judgment. He took a tentative step forward, then another, each movement slow and deliberate. The closer he came to the phoenix, the heavier the air seemed to grow, as if the creature's very presence bore down on him. Lysander knew this was the final test, but it was not one of endurance or strength. The phoenix had no need for such things. When he was mere feet from the bird, it spoke, not with words, but with a voice that reverberated in his mind, soft yet all-encompassing. "Why do you seek me, mortal?" The question echoed through Lysander's thoughts, its weight pressing down on his heart. He opened his mouth to speak, but found no words would come. He had prepared himself for this moment, had thought of what he might say to justify his quest. But in the presence of the phoenix, all of it felt small, hollow. The truth of his journey, of his heart, was laid bare in that gaze. There would be no lies here, no half-truths. "I seek the phoenix feather," he said at last, his voice hoarse from the trials he had endured. "To bring back the Princess Elara, to restore life where death has claimed her." The phoenix's eyes narrowed, its flames flickering with a subtle shift. The air around them hummed with an energy that made Lysander's skin tingle. And why should she live when so many have died? What makes her life worth more than another's? Why do you come to me, knight, when others have turned back? The question struck Lysander like blows, each one peeling away the layers of his intent. He had told himself he was on this quest for noble reasons, for the kingdom, for its people. But as the phoenix's words dug deeper, he realized there was more. A truth he had tried to bury beneath his duty. His voice faltered. I loved her." The admission came unbidden, spilling from his lips before he could stop it. The hollow within him, the emptiness that had grown with each sacrifice, was not merely for his kingdom, for the people who depended on their princess. It was for her, for Elara, whose laughter had once been the brightest part of his life. He had failed her in life, and now he sought to make amends in death. The phoenix tilted its head, its fiery plumage flickering with a cold brilliance. "Love," it said, the word heavy with meaning. "You seek her not just for the kingdom, but for your own heart. You seek to mend what cannot be mended. The feather is not a gift for selfish desires, nor is it a balm for broken hearts." Lysander felt the weight of the phoenix's judgment settle over him, colder than any flame. He had come this far believing he could save Elara, that he could undo what death had wrought. But now he understood. The phoenix did not grant life lightly. Its power was a force of balance, not a tool to be wielded by men with broken hearts. For a long moment there was only silence between them, and Lysander's heart sank under the gravity of his realization. I was wrong," he whispered, lowering his gaze. "I thought I could bring her back. But perhaps she's not meant to return. I cannot undo death. I came here believing I could, but I see now it's not my place." The phoenix's flames brightened, its eyes never leaving him. For what felt like an eternity, it hovered in silence, watching Lysander as if weighing the very soul he had left. Then slowly its wings began to fold, and the light in the clearing dimmed. "The heart's true intent is not easily hidden," the phoenix said softly, its voice almost a whisper now. "You have learned what many do not. But know this, knight, what is lost is not always gone forever. Your journey has not been in vain. Go now, and the forest will no longer hinder you. Lysander stood frozen, unable to speak, as the phoenix turned and rose higher into the sky, its light growing fainter until it disappeared into the distance. The clearing remained silent, the weight of what had passed settling over him like a shroud. He had passed the final test, but in doing so, he had lost more than he had ever expected to give. Lysander left the clearing, his footsteps heavy with the weight of truth. The forest had fallen into an unnatural stillness, as if the very trees and stones were holding their breath. The path ahead of him, once shrouded in mist and shadow, now lay clear, as though the forest itself had parted in recognition of his passage. But each step away from the phoenix's glow felt colder, lonelier. The fire within him had dimmed, and with it the hope he had clung to for so long. The trial was over, and yet it had left a deeper scar than the flames that had seared his flesh. He had faced not just the forest, but himself, and in that reflection had seen what he could not deny. His quest was not as noble as he had once believed. He had sought the feather to save Princess Elara, to restore life to what was lost. But in truth, it was for a selfish desire to undo his own failure, to quiet the guilt that gnawed at his heart. The phoenix had seen through him, had stripped away the layers of his pride and revealed the broken man beneath. And though he had passed the test by acknowledging his flawed intent, it had left him hollow. The feather, the object of his entire journey, had slipped through his fingers, and with it, the illusion that he could change the past. As Lysander walked, the familiar sounds of the forest began to return. Branches creaking in the wind, leaves rustling underfoot, the distant call of unseen birds. But these sounds no longer comforted him. Instead, they echoed like the whispers that had haunted him from the start, faint but persistent, reminding him of what he had left behind. It was dusk by the time he reached the edge of the cursed forest. The last sliver of daylight clung to the horizon, casting the world in shades of grey and gold. Ahead, he could see the kingdom of Elendor stretched out like a tapestry, the distant lights of the citadel flickering weakly in the twilight. A cold wind swept through the trees, carrying with it the scent of decay, of a kingdom on the brink of ruin. Lysander paused at the forest's edge, his gaze fixed on the citadel where King Arthur waited, still trapped in the prison of his grief. The princess lay entombed in stone, her life snuffed out by a sickness no healer could explain. He had left the kingdom with a promise, a vow to bring back the phoenix feather and restore hope to the dying land. But now he returned empty-handed, his soul fractured and worn. What would he say to the king? How could he explain that the feather was not meant to be taken, that it could not be wielded by the unworthy? The truth felt heavy on his tongue, a weight he was not sure he could bear. He had failed, not only the king, but the people of Elendor, who had pinned their hopes on his impossible quest. But the journey had changed him. He had faced the forest, the fire, and the phoenix itself, and in doing so, had come to understand that some things were not meant to be undone. Death, for all its finality, was part of the balance that governed the world. To meddle with it for personal reasons, even out of love, was to court disaster. The phoenix had shown him that much. With a deep breath, Lysander stepped out of the forest and began the long walk back to the citadel. The road was familiar, but it felt different now, emptier, as though he had left part of himself behind in the cursed forest. And perhaps he had. The forest had taken from him a piece of his soul, but it had also given him something in return: understanding. By the time he reached the citadel gates, night had fully fallen. The guards recognized him at once, their faces lighting with hope as they opened the gates and ushered him inside. News of his return spread quickly, and soon Lysander stood in the throne room facing King Arthur. The king rose from his throne, his eyes wide with expectation. "Sir Lysander," he said, his voice trembling with barely contained emotion, "you have returned. Tell me, did you find it? Did you bring the feather?" Lysander felt the weight of the moment press down on him, the king's desperation a tangible force that filled the room. He bowed his head, the words heavy in his mouth. "I have returned, my lord, but the feather, it is not what we believed it to be. The phoenix cannot be bargained with, nor can life be restored for selfish reasons. The journey has shown me that some things must remain lost." For a moment, the room was filled with silence so profound that even the air seemed to still. King Arthur's face twisted with confusion, then anger, then despair. His hands, once strong and steady, shook as he grasped the arms of his throne. "You failed," he whispered, his voice breaking. "You failed my daughter, and you failed this kingdom." Lysander met the king's gaze, his own heart heavy with the truth he could not escape. "I sought to bring her back, but I was wrong. The phoenix feather is not meant for those who seek to undo death. It is for those who understand that life and death are part of the same cycle." King Arthur staggered back, collapsing into his throne, his face pale as the truth washed over him. The throne room was filled with the weight of unspoken sorrow, and the air seemed thick with the echoes of all that had been lost. But in that reckoning, Lysander knew that his journey was not in vain. He had learned what the phoenix had tried to show him, that to hold on to the past, to refuse the natural order of things, was to invite darkness. And so, with that knowledge, he stood before the king, a man changed by the trials of the forest, and waited for the dawn that would bring the final part of his journey to an end. The throne room had never felt so hollow. Its grand marble pillars, once a symbol of Elendor's strength, seemed to loom over Lysander like the towering shadows of failure. King Arthur sat motionless upon his throne, his face pale and drawn, his eyes distant as if peering into some unreachable abyss. The weight of the night's words hung between them, filling the silence with an unbearable heaviness. Lysander stood before the king, his gaze steady but burdened with the truth he had brought back from the forest. He had returned without the phoenix feather. For what felt like hours, no one spoke. The court, once bustling with life, had grown quiet, the courtiers watching from the shadows, their eyes flickering between the king and the knight. Even the flickering torches along the walls seemed muted, casting long, distorted shadows that danced silently across the cold stone floor. At last, it was King Arthur who broke the silence. His voice was low, almost a whisper, trembling with an emotion Lysander could not name. You did not bring the feather. My daughter, my Elara, remains lost to me. His words were not a question, but a statement of shattered hope. Lysander bowed his head, the weight of his failure pressing down on him like a cold hand on his heart. The phoenix feather is not a gift to be taken, my lord, he said, his voice soft but resolute. It is not meant to bring back the dead for selfish reasons, even if those reasons are born from love and grief. The phoenix itself showed me that there are some things that must remain untouched, that life and death are part of the same cycle. The king's hands tightened on the arms of his throne, his knuckles white with the strain. His gaze flickered with anger, then sorrow, and finally resignation. You promised me, he said, his voice breaking. You promised you would bring her back. Lysander's heart ached at the king's words, but he did not look away. I did not understand, my lord. I believed I could, but the phoenix, it saw through me, through my intentions. It tested me. And in the end, I realized that the feather's power is not for those who seek to defy death, but for those who understand its purpose. The king rose slowly from his throne, his regal form now hunched with the weight of his grief. His eyes, once sharp and commanding, were clouded with the loss of his daughter, the loss of hope. And what of Elendor? He asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. What of my people? The sickness still spreads, the land still withers. Without Elara, without the feather, what hope is left? Lysander hesitated, searching for words that might offer comfort, but the truth was cruel in its simplicity. He had no answer for the king. The kingdom was dying, and the feather would not save it. He had come to understand that the power he sought could not be wielded for the purposes they had imagined. The phoenix's judgment had been clear. As if sensing his thoughts, King Arthur turned away, his back to Lysander, his voice tinged with bitterness. You returned without the one thing that could have saved her. You returned without the one thing that could have saved us all. The silence that followed was suffocating. Lysander's heart pounded in his chest, but still he did not move. The weight of the king's words settled over him like the ashes of a burned-out fire, cold and final. For a moment, he wondered if the phoenix had been wrong, if perhaps the feather could have been used to restore Alara, to bring hope back to Elendor. But deep down, he knew the truth. The phoenix had not denied him the feather out of cruelty, but out of wisdom. To meddle with the balance of life and death would have unleashed a darkness far greater than any sickness or famine. As the king stood before the empty throne, his figure silhouetted against the dying light of the torches, Lysander realized that this moment was not about the feather. It was about acceptance. It was about the reckoning that came when one confronted the finality of loss, the painful truth that some things could not be undone. Taking a deep breath, Lysander stepped forward. "I failed to bring back the feather, my lord, but I did not fail in learning its lesson. Life and death are bound together, and while we grieve for what is lost, we must also honor it. Alara's life was not in vain. She brought hope to this kingdom once, and we must carry that forward, even without her." The king did not turn, but Lysander could see his shoulders trembling, the weight of his grief too heavy to bear. "What am I to do without her?" the king whispered, his voice hollow, as though he was speaking to the emptiness itself. "You live," Lysander replied, his voice firm but gentle. "You live, and you remember, for her sake, for the kingdom's sake. It is not the feather that will save Elendor, my lord. It is the memory of those we have lost and the strength to carry on in their name." The king was silent, but something in the room shifted. A softening, a quiet acceptance that settled like the first light of dawn after a long, dark night. Lysander bowed deeply, then turned and left the throne room, his footsteps echoing softly against the stone floors.